I'm Daniel Allington. I'm a social scientist researching extremism, hate speech, and disinformation, with a particular focus on anti-Semitism. Hate speech is extremely difficult to define. It's very important when we're talking about hate speech that we're clear about what we mean. Unfortunately, one of the problems there is that there is no clear, widely accepted definition of hate speech. This is one of the problems that we've seen with social media companies. They all have policies against hate speech now, or at least all the major ones do. But it's often very difficult to tell what exactly it is that they've outlawed on their platforms, or that they're promising to remove. People will often be surprised at things that get removed. People will often be surprised at things that don't get removed. One of the things that I think we really need in society is a wide-ranging democratic discussion of what the boundaries of acceptable speech actually are. In practice, hate speech often ends up being defined as anything which is offensive to some group. That is a very problematic and I think dangerous way of defining hate speech. If we limit ourselves to saying only what will not be offensive to any group, then the limits of acceptable discourse get narrower and narrower over time. This is particularly the case with speech which is offensive to religious groups. There is much speech that is offensive to various religious groups, not because it is genuinely hateful, but because it is sacrilegious or blasphemous. Speech which is completely acceptable to one religion, and in fact which is necessary to one religion, may be offensive to another. A good example there would be the statement, Jesus Christ was the Son of God. This is an article of faith for Christians around the world. It is also a terrible blasphemy from the point of view of other religions. So we've got to be very careful that when we define hate speech, we're not simply referring to what is offensive to some group. If we're going to take meaningful action on hate speech, which doesn't end up reducing the limits of acceptable discourse to beyond what's tolerable, then I think we have to limit ourselves to talking about incitement. Speech which incites hatred, or worse, which potentially incites violence against particular groups, can legitimately be called hate speech, in my view. It's not enough for something simply to be offensive. Hate speech is not just what somebody finds offensive or what some group finds offensive. Hate speech, I think, has to be limited to what is actually inciting some form of action against particular groups or individuals. Hate speech is extremely difficult to measure. One of the problems that we've seen in recent years is social media companies trying to police hate speech algorithmically. They have employed large numbers of moderators to look at speech, especially in the English language. But this is very expensive, and there are large numbers of languages which you need to be able to track. What they've ended up doing is, for economic reasons, relying a lot on algorithms to detect what might be hateful. This quite quickly leads us into ridiculous situations where people get their Facebook accounts suspended for speech which was not hateful by any reasonable stretch of the imagination, simply because certain keywords there were picked up by an algorithm. If people think that it's just a matter of, computer says no, you can't say that, you used the wrong word, then you very quickly lose legitimacy. And without that legitimacy, the whole thing falls apart. We shouldn't be in the business of policing what people say in private unless it's actually illegal, for example, if two people are discussing committing a crime. However, what people say on social media is a step away from that. Talking to someone on social media is not like talking to someone else in your house. It's also not like talking to someone else on the telephone. Social media companies are not like telephone networks. They are more like broadcasters or newspapers. They are publishers, essentially. A newspaper cannot with impunity publish a letter from a member of the public calling for an armed uprising, calling for violence against a particular religious or demographic or racial group. And it is, or at least should be, the same for social social media companies. If I post something on Facebook, depending on my privacy settings, it could potentially end up by being seen by thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. I think initially with pro-terrorist content, and then more recently with disinformation around COVID-19, it became much more widely recognized that social media companies had a responsibility with regard to the ideas that people were disseminating. Now, unfortunately, when social media companies belatedly came around to the recognition that they had responsibility for this, they started taking responsibility by policing people's speech in ways that were heavy-handed and in ways that were widely perceived as illegitimate. And that has inevitably led to backlash. They have a responsibility, and they can and should be held to account for it. But that doesn't mean that the platform has a responsibility to, or even has a right to start policing what people say to each other on an individual level. It particularly doesn't mean that the platform should be immune from consequences if they go ahead and start regulating that speech in ways which are heavy-handed. For example, simply using some sort of algorithm which will spot keywords and take down videos or suspend people's accounts simply because they used words which have been blacklisted. That shouldn't be happening for people on an individual level, especially not if they're only communicating to small audiences. What has to happen, though, is that platforms have to recognize that if somebody has a business which involves disseminating particular kinds of ideas through the platform, then they can be held to account for having effectively partnered with that person to enable them to do this. People who make it their life's work to disseminate hateful ideas online, as well as people who make a profit from disseminating hateful content and disinformation, are very adept at passing under the radar. That is for them a professional skill. They have been good at that for decades. Ordinary people who maybe express their ideas a bit clumsily are much more likely to fall afoul of platforms' policies on hate speech. They haven't made a study of how to disseminate particular ideas without getting their content taken down. Notorious examples of coded hate speech from the far right would include the use of the number 88. What does that mean? Well, what's the eighth letter of the alphabet? It's an H. So 88 is HH. What does that mean? It means Heil Hitler. This kind of coded language has been used for a very long time online. Then there's audio content, things that people say in the soundtrack for a video. Auto-captioning is getting better and better. Auto-transcription of audio and video is getting better and better, but it's still very imperfect. Today, 2023, in the most intensively researched and analyzed language in the world, which is English, the auto-generated captions, which you will see on YouTube, are very inaccurate. When we're talking about other languages which haven't been studied to the same extent, auto-captioning may be less accurate or may not function at all. This means that there is actually no way there's not even any potential way of searching for particular keywords that might crop up in a video. To really address the issues involved, we may need to stop thinking about specific conspiracy theories and start thinking about conspiracy thinking. Conspiracy thinking is that way of understanding the world, that way of explaining phenomena, which produces conspiracy theories. It is the inclination to look for intentionality behind every bad thing that happens. It is the inclination to assume that human wickedness must be behind everything that goes wrong. It is the inclination to assume that people are plotting secretly behind your back, behind everybody's backs, away from the public sphere, and that these secret plots are what actually drives world history. This is conspiracy thinking. Conspiracy theories are used by many extremist groups as a recruitment tool because of their ability to foster grievance and to identify scapegoats, to encourage people to take action against those scapegoats. Now, I have no doubt at all that Adolf Hitler was personally motivated by his sincere belief in this illusory world conspiracy of the Jews. But was that necessarily the case for all of the people who carried out his orders? The historian Norman Cohn, who wrote what is still the definitive study of the anti-Semitic work, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, he argued that many of the sort of foot soldiers of the Nazi regime were essentially just criminals. They engaged in acts of brutality and plunder. He argues that for them, the myth of the Jewish world conspiracy simply it gave them a sort of alibi for themselves. He argued that what it did was it enabled them not to recognize themselves and each other for the common thieves and murderers that they really were. Conspiracy theories endure because conspiracy thinking endures. And conspiracy thinking endures because it's easy and it's satisfying. The explanations that professional conspiracy theorists provide for world events are ludicrously simplistic. So conspiracy thinking, it's a kind of a shortcut. Rather than thinking about all of the things that you've really got to think about in order to understand what's going on in the world, rather than thinking about all of the mess, all of the random events, the accidents, the mistakes, the things that went wrong, you just look for someone who you can blame for everything, and then say, or maybe even this person who I don't know planned for it all to happen. That somebody somewhere wanted all this to happen, and that's why it happened. It's a cognitive shortcut. It's also very satisfying. Conspiracy thinking enables you to cast yourself as the hero of a story. You can see yourself as the person who has seen through all the lies. In order to understand contemporary anti-Semitism, there are a number of things that we've got to recognize. One is that there's a lot of continuity with the past. Essentially, the same anti-Semitic myths that were in circulation throughout the 19th century, going back to the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution, they're still in circulation today. However, we've also got to understand that these myths have been repackaged. Many people will say that the conspirators who are ruining everything for everybody else are Jewish. There are many people who will come out and say that, but many others will not say Jews. They will say Zionists. They will say Israel. They will say Israel and its supporters. This is a way of kind of whitewashing the old ideas which have been discredited by their association with Nazism. Another thing that we have to recognize is that especially when anti-Semitic ideas are expressed not in relation to Jews identified as Jews, but in relation to, let's say, Zionists or Israelis or supporters of Israel, is that these ideas will often be propagated by people who see themselves and who are seen by society more widely as being not on the far right but on the far left. There are particular ways of expressing these same ideas which superficially sound like acceptable left-wing theory. This goes back a long time, but it's become particularly prominent in recent decades with the rise of anti-Israel activism. Now, obviously, it is not anti-Semitic to criticize the policies of the Israeli government. It's not anti-Semitic to subject Israel to the sort of criticism which any other country might be subjected to. But what we find a lot of the time is that what masquerades as criticism of Israel or of Israeli government policy is actually just a repackaging of traditional anti-Semitic ideas.